I'm now going to be showing you what we can do to modify influence of environment for controlling materials using the slope distortion. I have a scene here with just a standard terrain and two material layers on it using the large-scale rock and the large-scale pale grass. The rock being the layer on top of that, and under the environment I have just all of the options set to the max amount, and that's really the only change I made. So in other words, we're at a full slope range and no fuzziness options. You can load in this scene. It's called slope distortion underscore example underscore setup. So if you want to follow along or use this setup scene, you can just load that in. What we're going to do is control the alpha production, and we're going to be using the slope distortion filter. First, what I want to do is if we go over to the environment tab, I want to show you why this can be so useful by taking a look at an example before we go ahead and set anything up. So what we're going to do is start the slope range of this at 45 for the slope constraint. Actually, we'll go ahead and bring that up to maybe 55. And let's set our fuzziness options to, say, 3. So 3%. Now, because this is a standard terrain, there's really only so much detail you can get out of it. And with a lower resolution, it's really difficult to control the slope and get something that looks interesting because there's really not enough geometry there in order to make a nice transition between the different slope ranges. So the slope distortion filter, if we take a look, and what we're going to do is go ahead and set these values back to 0 for the fuzziness and then 0 to 180 full range for the slope. Go into our altitude production, and we're going to add in a filter node, MetaNodes, and slope distortion. What we're going to do is replace the constant node that I have set to -1 so that there is no alpha at all, and connect this to the slope distortion. And we can delete the constant node. So basically our white areas are where it's going to show up. There are a couple of different ways to control the slope distortion. If you are only going to be really kind of cutting out one area of the slope and you don't need to define it between ranges, then turn on the cut lower option. What that's going to do is cut out the low amount and make sure that the fall off doesn't apply. If I turn that on, we're going to start to see the fall off amount showing up towards the top, depending on what the high amount is set to. So let's go ahead and set the high to change it over to 45, and we also want to invert, and we can cut the lower portion. I'm going to change my fall off for the top, and we can set it to 0 if needed. I do want to make a quick note about the slope distortion that is used in some of the scenes, in the example scenes. For the example scenes, that slope distortion, if you want to replace it with the current slope distortion that's part of the installation, it'll allow you to type in a value of 0 for the top and the bottom without causing any problems. With the content versions, you'll have to use 0.05 as the minimum, where this one is going to automatically cut everything off and all the values down to 0.05. So 0 is actually 0.05 when I type it in. That prevents the low and the high values from overlapping each other and basically cutting each other out completely. So it has been slightly updated since then. So something to keep in mind in case you're are taking a look at any of those, I'm going to go ahead to my preview options up at the top and change the object size to 100 meters so we can see a little bit more what's going on within the function previews. I'm also going to go ahead and change over to the terrain version. So at the moment it looks basically the same as it did before. We have almost an identical setup. Because of the built-in distortion input and the way the fall-off will work differently from the values set for fuzziness, it will be a little bit different, but still, for the most part, really close. Now, the reason we don't really see any major changes is because the distortion hasn't been connected yet. What we need is a numeric fractal or a noise to create our distortion. And then we're going to connect that to our top distortion input. So we're going to add in a fractal node. Let's go ahead and use a grainy fractal. And it just went ahead and pulled up a preview, and we are going to need to change that so it's not a cube, which we have to do in the material editor. So first I'm going to go ahead and connect the slope distortion to the altitude output of the grainy fractal. And then closing this out, what we're going to do is open the options and set it to terrain. And then I also want to note that if you don't go into the function or back into the function with the same control, in this case the alpha production, the settings that you had set up for the scale of the material preview and also the background will not be applied. So that is a per function entrance depending on the output. So we can see that the bump and the color are the same because I changed the alpha or the settings within the alpha production, and that's the only one that's showing up with that preview. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. So what we're going to do is we need to tell the slope distortion or define how far of a distortion range we want. The distortion is basically just a change or a bending up or down within the high value. So with the distortion set to 3, we're not just going at a range of 45. We're actually going 3 degrees outside of it, 1.5 up and 1.5 down. So let's go ahead and change that distortion amount up to 8. And now we're going to have a degree of change of 8 controlled by that grainy fractal. And depending on the way you set up the gain output, you can get very interesting results depending on the number that you're sending. And that seems to apply more to other fractals. The grainy fractal, it does look like that the gain doesn't really go outside of a value of 1. Some of the newer fractals, which would be basically since version 7 or 8, the trained fractal, grainy fractal, the gain works a little differently than other fractals, so it may not actually increase the output amount. So in that case, you would have to multiply it or make some other changes within that link. So what I want to do is take the Z scale and bring it to 0.5, take Y and set it to 2. We'll add a bit of distortion, and I'm going to turn down the roughness amount. And then we can change the smooth area altitude. And edit the largest feature in metascale. And now I'm going to turn off the with rotation option. I'm also going to go back, and what we need to do is define our fall off amount. Right now it's a little low. The higher the amount, the smoother the transition is going to be. If it's too low, it's really going to cut it out, and that is somewhat dependent on the input. And you can see the changes. It can be somewhat subtle in some cases. We could also use a lower amount of distortion, but a higher amount of fall off. Because every fractal behaves differently, and rather than just sitting here and entering random settings until I get something that looks good, I've gone ahead and just kind of set this up a little bit more. I've turned off the cut lower option, set the low amount to 45 and the high amount to 65. When you use both the low and the high amount together, the distortion can come in from both sides of the slope, and it does make it look a lot better. Turned off the invert option, and I have the fall off set to 12 for both of these. And I haven't made any changes to the grainy fractal. I am going to go ahead and increase the gain. And then make just a few more changes here. So we'll do 300 for the metascale, 60 for the largest feature. We got 0.8 for the variation roughness, and negative 0.12 for the smooth area altitude, distortion at 0.75, filter steepness at 8.4, and the gain amount set to 7.5. So now, instead of having every single area be such a smooth line and sharp cutoff, it does vary a lot more. There are still a few areas that need a little work, and that's going to depend on the size of the fractal and, of course, the different distortion settings. In this case, it looks like we need to take the bottom level fall off and increase that amount. And a lot of the changes you'll see will really be dependent just really on what you're using as a distortion. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and switch this over to a different distortion. And we're going to add in, actually we don't even need to add in a different fractal, we can just go ahead and change this one over to the terrain fractal. So what we'll do is we'll use the ridges mode, we'll turn up bump surge, increase our gain, and then we can modify our largest and smallest features. Go ahead and change the Z scale down to 0.2. Actually, we'll go ahead and switch this over to billows. Add a bit of distortion. And then just kind of modify the gain until we get a good range. And then going into the slope distortion, we can modify the distortion amount. We can set the high level a little bit higher. Maybe bring down the low range. Because if the distortion is too high, then that low and high level, they really become kind of relative because of the different changes in the input. Also keep in mind that when you start using higher levels of distortion, depending on the input, eventually you will see a reverse, and you may need to invert the function. In this case, it looks like this one's going to be alright with a higher level of distortion if needed, but it is cutting out a lot of the alpha because of the gain. So we can change that gain amount in order to really ramp up the distortion if needed, because you can do some pretty cool effects with that. Now, it does look like we're really going to need something, basically a smaller fractal. Because the overall scale of the material is 10, which is much higher than the material layer scale, we need to use some smaller values to actually get that to show up properly within the scene. So let's get a better idea by setting the top scale to 1. And so we can reduce just the overall scales, and then when we are editing the function, we'll see a little bit better how that's going to affect the way this looks. So what I also want to do is take our wavelength and bring it down a lot lower. Because we really just weren't seeing a lot of the fractal because it was just too big in comparison to the way the scene was scaled. So we should be able to see something that looks a lot more interesting now. So we'll just adjust our gain to get a good balance. You might have to reduce the fall off, but we'll take a look. It's definitely looking much better already. Okay, so this is closer to what I originally had intended to do. You can see a lot better distortion and just changes within that slope. Lots of areas being kind of pulled off and on. So the idea is to really have a fractal that's small enough to cover those areas. And I mean, since we're just controlling the alpha with this, it's not like working with color information where you need a larger scale with the metascales and things like that in order to make it look more real and more natural with good variations and not having too much repeating. So this is definitely looking better. What we can also do is use this output to manipulate the additional channels in order to make the blend look a lot better, because right now it's just, there's no real good transition. It's just material just looks like it was just kind of thrown on there. So there's no change in the color that reacts to the change in that material not being in a certain location. So what we can do is modify some of the other aspects. Now, because we're controlling the rock, we have to use this to control the rock channels, because there's no way to pass the information directly to the grass unless we copy and paste the function over. But then our scales we have to make sure that our scale is the same between the materials. And right now they are. So that does make it a little bit easier if we want to also work on the grass. Now what I'd like to do for the output of the large-scale rock, and for a second there that material did disappear, and there was a little bit of a bug in a previous version where changes made within the material editor were being removed when you clicked on the preview. That's only a problem with the standalone version. But I clicked OK, reopened it, and everything looks like it's still there. So what we're going to do is take the output from the slope distortion, and we're going to connect it to our bump output. So we're going to add in a combiner node and mix those two together. And that's going to give us, in this case, a pretty harsh edge. And the direction it's going in is going to depend on the way we have the output. We do want to invert the slope distortion before it reaches the blender. So we're going to select the link between the slope distortion and the blender, add a filter, set it to opposite, and we might have to reconnect it. Because we do want to, in this case, we're going to try to raise it up, see how that looks. So with the blender set to multiply at 1, we do have some of the areas raised, some of them lowered, because of the way the multiply works. But there's nice little changes within that bump around that area of the distortion, which is kind of cool. So what I also want to do is modify the color a little bit, dependent on that. Now, because our slope distortion output in this case is very harsh of a cutoff, it's going to be difficult to modify the colors properly. So what I want to do is create another copy of this to make further modifications. We're going to copy the slope distortion, so selecting it, Control-C on the keyboard, Control-V then to paste, and it'll automatically connect itself to the terrain fractal. And what we want to do is set up our color so we'll be able to actually see the changes. And what we're going to do is multiply, add another combiner node, this will work pretty well. And I want just basically a black and white gradient. One cool thing about the slope distortion is it does have a built-in color output. So it does take the numeric information and automatically converts it to color information as well. So that way you don't have to set up any additional connectors. So now what we're going to do is modify the slope distortion. We're going to invert, and I want to use a higher amount of fall off. And we may need to adjust some of the other settings in order to fall within the range. But since we're still using the same distortion input, the features will line up very nicely where they're needed to. And we'll go ahead and increase the distortion amount. So the higher we start cutting in, the lower, the more of a darker edge we're going to see. Let's go ahead and use a value of 45. And that looks pretty good. Just a nice little change. What I also want to do is modify the grass basically in the same way. We're going to take, just starting with the original, we're not going to bring this modified one because that's more modified just for the rock. We already need different values for the grass. I am going to select both of these nodes, Control-C to copy them, click OK, go into the large scale pale grass, edit the function, and paste those in. And we do need to modify the preview. And basically same thing, we're going to multiply with the blender and we're going to make those additional changes within the slope distortion. So we'll go ahead and change the fall off, and using a very high fall off can produce a really nice looking material and a really cool transition. So we're going to see how that looks. We might need to extend the range a bit. I am going to bring the high value down to 70. And just adjust the low value. And anytime you go over 45 for the top or the bottom fall off or the distortion, really depending on the range between the low and the high, you do in some cases overlap or flip things around. So you'll just have to kind of type in different values and try it out. Maybe lower one value in order to increase another one. We'll go ahead and try that. So 45 for the top, 70 for the bottom fall off. Distortion, maybe we'll bring that up a little higher. Or actually, we'll bring it down lower to 18. Now the grass looks pretty good, but we're not seeing much of a change on the rock. So we will need to adjust the range that it's being modified in, because it definitely does not look like it did within the material editor. And that's because the preset terrain within there is a lot different. So we can see that the changes really aren't taking place within the area that is showing up within the scene. So what we need to do is bring in the darker range a lot further, because if you take a look between the alpha and the color, even though it has a different type of preview, the slope ranges for the most part can be compared pretty well, and it's just not going to transfer well. One thing I'm going to do is go back to the color production of the grass and take that lower value and make a few changes to that. And then we're going to go into the large scale pale rock, edit, and modify that distortion. So we really need to bring it in more, and in order to do that we need to decrease some of these values. We could also really ramp up the distortion. Also keeping in mind you can control the distortion with another fractal to have the distortion amount vary. So that is kind of cool. But you will need to map it to fall within a certain distortion range. If you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, basically the output of this terrain fractal is 1 to -1. In this case, it's really more cutting off at 0. It doesn't really fall below 0 much. What you need to do is take a map filter. So adding a filter, setting it to map. You need to define the range of the input. So we'll make sure that within the map the upper value is 1. And I'm just switching between the output here so we can take a look at the function node preview. Selecting the link, the lowest point, maybe -0.25. And it looks about right. If you need to increase the size of the function node preview, you can just drag that down. And it does look like maybe -0.3 might work a little better. So our lower value is -0.3. And now we need to define our output range. So if we were going to control the distortion with this, right now we have it set to 45, so we'd want either our lower or higher value to be around that amount. So let's go ahead and set our lower to 40, so that -0.03 is equal to 40, and our 1 value is going to be equal to, say, 50. And then we can extract the distortion and connect that to the map output. So now our distortion is also going to be changed by the fractal. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect that for now. What you can also do is modify the low and high amounts that way, or the fall off. Anything can be extracted and connected to other values. They'll just need to be mapped correctly in order to fit. So I'm going to increase our low value to 48. And let's go ahead and take a look at that. So you can now see the range is a lot farther. In this case, I'd probably reduce that distortion amount. Maybe just some of the fall-offs to make it blend a little better, and maybe even invert it because it looks like the edges are a lot lighter, and I'd rather have the edges be a little bit darker. So what we could do is just make a few changes here. Because really, depending on the range of each one of these settings, you can get a different kind of output. And let's go ahead and increase that upper value. But don't want to darken it too much, so so it's really just a matter of tweaking it from here. What I've done is taken just a slight change between the high and low value. So close to the original values where I had 40 to 90, so now I have 45 to 85. Just bringing it in, add 5 to the distortion, and I do have my fall off set pretty high. I am going to bring that down a little. And in some cases you may notice more of a fall off in one direction than the other, and a lot of that has to do really with just the preview, because you're seeing different ranges within that sphere. It doesn't quite represent things properly always. Maybe a little more tweaking here and there to get it to fall within the range, but it's looking pretty good for the most part. So slope distortion really adds more detail to the terrains that just don't have enough geometry to properly calculate slope and make it look interesting. You can also, of course, use this with procedural terrains and then pull out even more detail based on the procedural geometry. So you can load in this scene at the point it's at right now, called slope distortion underscore example underscore A, or the A example. And if we go ahead and edit the object for the terrain, what we're going to do is go up to the top and convert it to a procedural terrain. And we're going to add a bit more detail to it. Next, right now it's only 512 by 512, or it was as a standard terrain. We crank up the detail a little bit, add some features to it, we can make it look a lot better. So we're going to add in a fractal, and we'll go ahead and use a terrain fractal. We also need to add a multiply by a constant math node. So add a math node, multiply by a constant. Go ahead and set that to 64. And we'll increase the largest feature. I'm going to remove the metascale. Once the metascale is lower than the largest feature, we shouldn't be able to see it anymore, and we should be able to get finer details. I'm going to decrease the gain amount because I don't want to modify the current terrain a lot, or not too much. Change our wavelength options. Let's take a look at that. So this is the render with the procedural terrain. So not only do we have the detail and the extra detail being added by the procedural terrain to change the slope ranges and really enhance the material, we also have the slope distortion with it, so you can really see lots of nice little fine details and transitions between the different areas. So the slope distortion filter, it's very useful and is a very powerful part of the snowFlaKe toolset. And you can load in this modified version as the slope distortion underscore example underscore a-2.